Okay, I think we're on. Welcome to the opening event of our week-long Houdini extravaganza, which is featuring 4 performances of Muriel Rukeyser's play, a poetry wall of submitted poems. By the way, there's one at the Halley Library, one at Riverside Art Center, but many of you are, of course, not here in Ypsilanti to see it. We hope to post them on the website themselves. And there is this webinar. Before I get started on the webinar, I want to thank the Michigan Humanities for their generous grant in support of these events, and EMU Center for Jewish Studies, the English Department, and IPSI Rights for their support as well. There are so many individuals to thank, a lot of volunteers, and too many to name. So I'd like to single out Carly Mishek, who is right here, who's my assistant. Shana White, who is the administrative assistant of the English department, the folks at the Office of Research and Development who helped me with the grant, and my many Rukeyser friends, some of them in attendance, and of course everybody here on this webinar panel. Thanks so much for being here. So before introducing our speakers for today, I'm going to hand things over to my colleague Marty Schickman, who is also the director of the Center for Jewish Studies.
Good morning. It's a delight and a privilege for Eastern Michigan University Center for Jewish Studies to participate in the events surrounding our live readings of Muriel Rukeyser's Houdini. These are magical, ambitious events about the world's greatest magician, a man of considerable ambition, the son of Jewish immigrants, the son of a rabbi, who in a time of growing hostility towards Jews kept the world transfixed on his accomplishments. It takes some considerable sleight of hand to coordinate such events, to bring together the Center for Jewish Studies, the EMU Library, the Department of English, the Department of Communications, Media, and Theater Arts, to find the grant support, including a Michigan Humanities grant, and the private support to make possible EMU's Rukeyser Houdini project. And for this, I would like to thank my brilliant colleague, Professor Elizabeth Deumer. I would also like to thank Professor Lee Stilley for directing the live readings of Houdini that will be available at 3 venues, including EMU this afternoon. And finally, the Center for Jewish Studies is only able to support events like Houdini because of our friends and donors who believe in the many missions of Eastern Michigan University. I would like to offer them my sincerest appreciation. I'll now turn you over to Professor Deumer to get us started. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marty. Thank you a lot. So some of you are wondering whether you are on. If you signed up for the webinar, your face is not going to appear. It's only the panelists that appear, but you can put comments in chat and the Q&A, and we will get to your comments. So we will begin today with 2 about 20-minute talks by Jan Freeman and Stefania Heim. Matthew Solomon will join us for the subsequent conversation and provide a response of his own. As audience, you are welcome to submit comments and questions by chat that Carly will relay to speakers during our conversation. So let us begin. Our first speaker today is Jan Freeman. Jan is the author of 3 collections of poetry, most recently Blue Structure, and she is co-editor of Sisters, an anthology. Poems from her manuscript in progress, Mobius, are forthcoming or recently appeared in Barrow Street, the Brooklyn Rail, and other venues. Jan founded Paris Press, now housed at Wesleyan University Press, in 1996 to bring back into print Muriel Rukeyser's The Life of Poetry, a classic, if there ever was one. Paris Press also published Rukeyser's Houdini, a musical, and her The Orgy, again, another text that will have to become a classic. Jan teaches at the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art ekphrastic poetry retreats and writing through nature and art poetry workshops. Her talk today is entitled, Let Me See, Let Me Feel, Let Me Know What Is Real, Publishing Houdini, a Musical. Welcome, Jan.
Thank you. I am really happy to be part of this event celebrating Houdini at last. And I'm so grateful to you, Elizabeth, for founding the Rukeyser Living Archive at EMU, which is helping to keep the work of Rukeyser known throughout the country and throughout the world. And it is really wonderful to be here with Stefania and with Matthew. I want to begin by offering you the lines, which are the lines of the title of the talk, that for me are really pivotal in Houdini. Let me see, let me feel, let me know what is real, let me believe. These lines have many meanings in the musical. They relate to Harry Houdini's acts of illusion and escape, to relationships, characters, and events in the musical, to seances, and perhaps also to religion, to Judaism as well. And I wonder, how many times in every day does each of us need these lines? For me, they basically relate to all aspects of being alive. Let me open my eyes to know what is real, what is not real. Let me believe the truth, experience it physically, fully comprehend it, in addition to the calculated illusions that prevent knowing and belief. Anyone who has experienced trauma knows, as I do, the involuntary brain freeze that blocks the truth emotionally and neurologically. And that, to me, is a component here, understated in the musical as well. The lines resonate for me as a poet. They articulate what propels me through absolutely everything that I write, which I imagine may be true for many of you here, writing towards understanding. And these lines basically carried me through all that I did as the director of Paris Press, as I tried to offer the public absolutely essential and groundbreaking, yet previously overlooked literature by women. That was basically the mission of Paris Press, which is now housed at Wesleyan University. I have devoted much of the last 30 years to increasing the public's understanding of and appreciation for the literary works of Rukeyser. This began when I was 27 and a graduate student at NYU, studying with Galway Kinnell and Sharon Olds, two major champions of Rukeyser. And it then extended into my late 30s when I founded the nonprofit Paris Press, specifically to bring back only one book, which was The Life of Poetry. And that is a book that continues to be among the most inspiring and necessary books that I have ever read. Everything that I published and all the educational outreach programs I sponsored through Paris Press were infused with Rukeyser's ethos expressed in The Life of Poetry. Boundaries between disciplines are false. Everything is connected, as Rukeyser shows us in Houdini. And it is essential for Americans to live with the arts, especially poetry, for us to become sensate and compassionate human beings. And while this is necessary all the time, in times of crisis such as now, with the continuing horror and devastation in Ukraine and the threats to our own democracy with right-wing misinformation campaigns and the curtailing of voting rights, abortion rights, daily experiences of poetry and the arts will help all of us to feel, to think, and to take action. After publishing The Life of Poetry in 96 and then The Orgy in 98, which, like Houdini, embodies all of what Rukeyser spoke about in The Life of Poetry, I contacted the New York Public Library and the Library of Congress, where most of Rukeyser's archives are held, to see if there were any unpublished Rukeyser manuscripts that Paris Press might consider bringing back into print. And that's when I learned about Houdini from Jeff Flannery at the Library of Congress, who told me about the files he had of the musical, which had been produced in '73 in Lenox, just an hour from where I live. And I was incredibly curious. Jeff wound up going through the drafts, the ephemera, and the various materials related to the Lennox performance and the writing of the musical. And he described them to me on the telephone. Email was definitely not what it is today. He then snail mailed me photocopies of what appeared to be the last edited versions Muriel had worked on after the Lennox performances. I read through the documents. Everything is now at Amherst College's Frost Library, where Paris Press's archives are housed. And I saw, there was Christopher Walken's name as the star of the Lennox production in what I assume was one of his earliest roles. And there was this delicious note from Monica McCall, Rukeyser's renowned agent and her longtime partner. And the note said, "Frame of investigation, persecuting ourselves into truth. The magic is in the waking." Oh my God. And then on the same page, Monica included a quote from Marilyn Monroe. "If you want your dream to come true, you have to wake up." And then there were the Houdini manuscripts, which included passages taken from the 1926 congressional hearings about fortune telling. The themes in Houdini were themes that ran through all of Rukeyser's work, in my mind: the body, family, love, eroticism and sensuality, imprisonment and freedom, masks, the locks and keys of the heart, the mind, creative expression, communication, and views into history, into politics. Houdini appeared to mirror Rukeyser psychologically, poetically, while reflecting the extraordinary breadth of her interest. Reading the manuscript, I felt Emily Dickinson's, if I read a book and it makes my whole body so cold, no fire can warm me, I know that is poetry. If I feel physically as if the top of my head were taken off, I know that is poetry. And I wanted other people to experience this work of what I felt was transcendent brilliance. I learned that Rukeyser had written Houdini from the late 40s or early 50s through the early 70s, the span of the years following the Second World War, the Red Scare, the civil rights and the women's rights movement, and the Vietnam War, all of which in my mind are reflected through the verse drama. And I learned that the writing of Houdini spanned the first 23 years of Monica McCall's and Muriel's relationship. I wondered, how much of the musical responded metaphorically to their life together? And was this a collaboration, which some of the notes seem to indicate, or were Monica's comments those of a thorough, attentive agent, which she was well known to be? I assumed the former at the time that I published the book, and now I wonder if it might have been the latter or simply a mix of the two. The theme of the body in Houdini particularly captured me. It was a theme that had drawn me to Rukeyser's poems from the time I was a college student at Vassar, her alma mater. And of course, in the musical, Houdini's body is, of course, the literal focus. He says, "I speak through the body" at the congressional hearings. But there's also Bess's body, the body of Volante, the African-American star of the circus, and metaphorically, the lesbian body, the body of the mother, the body of the wife. Throughout Houdini, there is the body of desire. Bodies are empowered, they're sexualized, they are elusive, they are contorted, imprisoned, connected, disconnected. They are mortal, and Houdini's body repeatedly defies death, as Houdini did in real life in his uncountable performances. The body is defined, and yet it defies definition through the escape artist formulas and by breaking rules. In Houdini, bodies are locked by societal mores, religion, racism, misogyny, family mores, and also shame. And Houdini and Muriel Rukeyser show that the body can be freed, the chains untangled, the locks sprung. Bess says to Houdini in Rukeyser's most iconic line, later used again in the poem Katha Kollwitz, what would happen if one woman told the truth about her life? The world would split open, which swings me back to the life of poetry and the power of poetry and art to invite feeling, which requires thought, which requires action. So these responses were among many that led me to declare to my board of directors that Houdini was groundbreaking and Paris Press should publish it. The literary quality of the manuscript I found was extraordinary, and the social and psychological suggestions of Houdini through metaphor were essential. It was serious and it was also playful. It zeroed in on perception, on fear, on safety, what was safety in a chain box in a river. How did love affect truth, knowing, belief? The musical also posed the questions, what is the role of the artist, the poet in society? To perhaps dispel fear, dispel illusion, to present what is real, literally or sideways. And all of this resonated for me as a poet. My own poems were, from childhood on, a movement towards knowing what was true, what was illusion, and the body was the key to understanding my own identity, history, my family, the world around me. For me, poetry was, and it continues to be, thank God, the way towards dispelling myths, idolatry, and illusion. My mantra when publishing Rukeyser's work was always her lines, first a yes, then what? And first a no, then a yes. The actual journey of publishing the book took about 3 years. There was a treasure hunt to acquire permission to publish the book, which alone took 2 years. With the guidance of a wonderful attorney from Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts, Mark Comras, I requested a copy of Rukeyser's will from the New York Surrogate Court in Manhattan. And in the days before internet, this in itself took a really long time. The will indicated that Rukeyser left Houdini to Monica McCall. And then I discovered that Monica had died. And I had to request a copy of her will to find out who she'd left Houdini to, which was more waiting. And then from Monica's will, I learned that Catherine Graham owned the rights. And then I had to find this Catherine. I almost hired a detective, but I pursued my sleuthing and located Catherine's daughter in Toronto and discovered that Catherine, or Kitty, lived there too. And she graciously granted Paris Press permission to publish Houdini. I really, really hope that Kitty and Dorothy are here on Zoom today. After acquiring permission, as always, the funding of the publication was a challenge since Paris Press operated on a very lean hand-to-mouth budget, week to week. I applied for grants and we received our first NEA, which was very exciting. We also received support from the Mass Cultural Council, and the remaining funds came from individuals, mostly in contributions of well under $50. As I was raising the funds, I learned that the world's largest private collection of Houdini artifacts was owned by Sid Radner, a rug salesman who lived amazingly just down the road in Holyoke, Massachusetts, where, according to Sid, Houdini first freed himself from police handcuffs in 1895. Matthew will probably know whether that's real or not. And Sid invited me to his home, and I gave him the manuscript to read to see what he thought of it. And to my relief, he loved it and he endorsed the book. And he then showed me part of his collection of posters, handcuffs, basically everything Houdini. Most of his collection was at the Houdini Historical Center in Appleton, Wisconsin. But Sid had one of the iconic Houdini posters in his basement, and he gave me permission to use it on the cover of the book. Then I found a fabulous designer, Ivan Holmes in San Diego, who designed the gorgeous cover and the text. And I tracked down David Spangler, the composer, in Florida, and he provided me with lyrics from a few of the songs which were missing in the Rukeyser manuscript. I pitched Houdini to our distribution company, Consortium, and Adrienne Rich endorsed the book, unfortunately, just after it had gone to press. and she said, Houdini is the most exhilarating, disturbing, and triumphant theater script I've read since Tony Kushner's Angels in America. High praise. For promotion, I made Paris Press t-shirts with quotes from the musical on the back. And I ordered a few hundred chocolate bars using the cover of the book, the poster, as the wrapper. The last 45-pound carton led to a chocolate-eating bear entering my house, who I named Bess to quell my fear, and that's another story. We all survived. It was very magical. As always, I sent out 200 to 300 bound galleys and later the finished books to reviewers, editors, including magic publications, newsletters, and museums. And I reached out to a wide variety of poets as well as entertainers, such as Penn and Teller, David Copperfield, Tom Cruise, who I'd heard was interested in Houdini. And of course, I tried to get in touch with Christopher Walken. But it was difficult to get the critical attention for Houdini, since it read as a play and mixed genre, crossing boundaries, which is, of course, Rukeyser's strength, was not popular at the time, as it is today. Good reviews appeared in Booklist, Rain Taxi, and Magic publications, but unfortunately, the New York Times, the New York Review, NPR didn't bite. One snag in the publication, it didn't include the score. Had I been able to include it, I think it would have added a really luscious dimension and enticed theater companies and drama departments to produce it. I really wanted to hear the musical. And at one point I tracked down Neva Small, who played Bess in Lennox. And amazingly from a payphone in New York City, she sang a couple of the songs, which were fabulous. Also, the musical was long, making it hard to find theater companies to take it on. And then just when I published Houdini in 2002, there was a new Houdini production scheduled for Broadway. And even though 3 of my friends who had Broadway and off-Broadway connections did try to help find a producer for Houdini, nothing panned out. There were near productions, one right here in Northampton at the Academy of Music, where Houdini had actually had a secret door built into the floor of the stage before his show there, but that also fell through. I did adapt the verse drama myself for a reading of Houdini at Chicago's AWP conference, and people amazingly still talk about that. We had an incredible cast of poets from around the country. Some of them are here today. And Peter Sagal from Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me played Houdini, and that was really fabulous. Rukeyser's stage instructions are so gorgeous that I wound up creating a narrator to read them aloud. And then this was really magic. During the rehearsal and the performance, all the poets spontaneously invented their own melodies and sang the lyrics of the songs. So it was a wonderful experience. Now the performances this week, thanks to Elizabeth and EMU, are for me really a waking dream come true. And I hope they will lead to other productions and to new readers and course adoptions for the book. The themes really feel useful now in the midst of the pandemic as we face national threats to democracy, to our most basic voting rights, in an atmosphere of calculated lying and illusion. And as internationally, we face the horrifying catastrophe in Ukraine, as well as the ongoing destruction from climate change. For me, Houdini is completely relevant, even as it speaks to circumstances that were, of course, unknown to Rukeyser 49 years ago, but which she very well might have imagined as the literary prophet that she was. So I feel very honored to have published Houdini, and I'm thrilled that it is now receiving the long-deserved attention, thanks to EMU and to Elizabeth. So thank you.
I have to unmute myself. Thank you so much, Jen. You got some comments. There's a question from Vivian Pollack that we have to get to. Let us not forget about ballet and Nijinsky and Houdini. So we'll keep that in mind, very important. But and wonderful that you stuck to your 20 minutes because that gives us time to move forward. And I'm going to introduce Stefania Heim, our next speaker. She's the author of the award-winning collection Our Book, and another one, A Table That Goes On for Miles, and the NEA-winning translator of Geometry of Shadows, Giorgio de Chirico's Italian poems. Her scholarly and lyric essays, including many on Rukeyser, have appeared in venues including Journal of Modern Literature, Textual Practice, Journal of Narrative Theory, Paris Review, Jacket 2, and many others. She is editor of Rukeyser's unpublished essay, Darwin and the Writers, available through Lost and Found Documents Initiative, and former editor of Boston Review and a founding editor of Circumference, Poetry and Translation. And as of fall of this year, she will be an associate professor of English at Western Washington University. So Stefania's talk today is entitled Myth, Fact, and the Stairway Between, Muriel Rukeyser's Houdini. Very, very happy to have you here, Stefania.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And just my thanks for you, no bounds for all of your amazing work, just on Rukeyser, on the Houdini play, bringing us all together and for making this event possible. I'm very, very, very grateful. And I'm so delighted to be talking here today with Jan and with Matthew and seeing all of you here in attendance. So thank you. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. My talk is going to be a little different than Jan's. Hold on, I have to do the slideshow. A little bit of a sort of walk through some of the archival documents in my research on Houdini. So sort of the prequel to all of Jan's work and getting the play into our hands and to audiences. There's a bunch of archival documents here that I have images of, all from the Library of Congress Muriel Rukeyser papers. And an enormous thanks to Bill Rukeyser, who's given permission to share these and is just so generous and such a champion of his mom's work. So here it is. Myth, Fact, and the Stairway Between, Muriel Rukeyser's Houdini. Harry Houdini first shows up in Muriel Rukeyser's published works in her 1939 book of poems, Turning Wind, in the poem Speech for the Assistant from Houdini. Already, we see ideas that will remain urgent to her in the 3.5 decades she will spend thinking, researching, and writing about this iconic figure. There's loneliness, fear, dream, and appetite. There's the terrifying recognition that only those passed through madness have any sense for us. Already, she's dealing with this singular human relationally. This speech is for and from not Houdini himself, but the assistant, the character who in later versions of the play will become Marco Bone, the self-invented man, Houdini's manager, his double, not his father, the deep friend of his power and ambition, and the play's caller, conscience, and master of ceremonies. I want to foreground this relationality right from the start, because just as much as extreme physical life, and says that's Rukeyser's line, is the thematic heart of the play, so too are juggling images of oneself and attempts at communication. As always in Rukeyser's work, and here, even for an individual so singular in the public imagination, relations and relationships are key. The very first pitch that I've been able to find that Rukeyser made for a dramatic presentation of Houdini was shortly after the publication of A Turning Wind. Her proposal to Radio City Music Hall is dated January 8th, 1940, and it features not only an assistant, but 2 doubles for Houdini, Houdini the juggler and Houdini the acrobat. These alter egos give flesh to the drama of the play, Houdini's transformation, as Rukeyser writes, into American hero. In this, he shares qualities with so many of the figures who intrigued her, her heroes of the meeting place. Quote, all those Americans who have, in smaller and greater ways, won through their restrictions, inventors, flyers, heroes in sport, artists. She goes on to say this of Houdini: he warns of the restrictions of the world and the necessity of breaking through. Through the 1950s, Rukeyser kept up a steady stream of correspondence and pitches about her Houdini project. And this is a little bit of a timeline from what I've been able to find. She corresponded with Doris Humphrey about a possible ballet play, with RKO Pictures, with her old Vassar teacher, Hallie Flanagan Davis, now at Smith College Theater Department, with the Dean of American Composers, Aaron Copland, with Brecht translator, Eric Bentley, with playwright and novelist Thornton Wilder, with Houdini's sister, Gladys Weiss. This correspondence, along with the correspondence that picks up a decade later, concluding with the Lenox production and the edits she made around a possible agreement with Andre Gregory, is a rich trove of information about her developing concerns, as well as her creative and intellectual process. Drawing from this correspondence and from Rukeyser's notes and drafts, what I'd like to argue today is that it's not just thematically that Rukeyser's musical relates so powerfully to many of her lifelong obsessions and radical ideas, and as Jen so beautifully argued, to our present, but also formally, by which I mean in Houdini, Rukeyser puts into motion her ideas about documentary poetics and poetry as a meeting place between the concrete and the mythical, where, as she writes in Life of Poetry, form and content, relation and function reach and merge. Now you might, I don't know, you're here at a Rukeyser reading, so you might not, but you might find this to be a surprising claim, given that we're talking about a piece of musical theater. And if so, you would not be alone, though Rukeyser does argue in the Life of Poetry that, quote, musical comedy theater, for all its stupidities, may be closer to being usable than The Weekend, by which I think she means intellectual theater. Through the entirety of the 35 years that Rukeyser worked on Houdini, she received feedback precisely along these lines: concern about her categories, definitions of form. Readers were worried that she was conflating symbol and life, fact and fantasy, history and myth, and they pushed back especially against the documentary aspects of her text. Once again, the most radical aspects of her work were the most illegible to her contemporaries. Rukeyser's Houdini, I think, compels us to ask what it means to make something of and from a particular person's life. It interrogates our attraction to Houdini and the implications of the analogies that grow so lushly around him. And here, I'd like to do a very quick gloss of the arc of the play, illustrated with some maps that Rukeyser drew of the narrative. And you'll notice these amazing swirls that she has. You'll see it in 2 slides that I have here. The plot follows the basic narrative of Houdini's life. Houdini, born Eric Weiss, meets and marries Bess. They withstand the hardships of insecure early years doing whatever it takes for a seedy traveling circus. There's a scene dedicated to Houdini's first prison break and one to his perilous escape from a frozen river, during which Bess hears a newsboy report his death. In its later versions, the second act focuses on Houdini's relationship to spiritualism, his friendship with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and attempt through Lady Doyle to contact his beloved mother after her death. The seance, you see it here with the materialization of Sherlock Holmes, was a failure according to Houdini, and he dedicated the rest of his life to the exposure of false mediums. Rukeyser's final scene interweaves Houdini's testimony at the 1926 Congressional Subcommittee hearings on fortune telling, which he attended at his own initiative to condemn fraudulent clairvoyance, and the punch in the stomach he received at the hands of a medical student, long mythologized falsely as a precipitating event in his death, which was in fact the result of an infection from a ruptured appendix. Houdini dies, and Bess drinks and waits for some supernatural sign from him, which the audience, at least, receives in the form of an elliptical closing monologue. In her directions for the play's Lenox cast, Rukeyser provides this arc. In the first act, his escapes deepen, his old life, the trunk, the jail, the frozen river. The second act is the challenges, which she describes elsewhere as total risk, fame, honesty, Bess, the hearing, coming through, light. Through the process of writing, she would often refer to Act 1 as locks and Act 2 as keys. And in her final notes into the 1970s, she begins more and more to use this phrase, self-liberator, to describe the second half of the play and the significance of her conclusion. The stakes of magic at this point, she suggests, shift to the intimate and the real. In the earliest proposals of the play, Rukeyser had listed Aaron Copland as her dream composer. I don't know if she ever approached him about this directly, but on February 1st, 1952, he wrote her a short note responding to her script on letterhead from the Harvard Music Department, where he was then serving his tenure as the Charles Eliot Norton Professor of Poetics. He confesses, "I read the play and puzzled over it greatly. I'm not at all sure I get it, but it does seem to me you're trying to do a very difficult thing, the mixing of styles. You probably don't realize the sharp contrast for the reader of straight talk and symbolic talk. I don't see how, in the present state of the theater, you could hope to get away with it in a big time production." What Copland here frames as styles, Thornton Wilder articulated in a longer letter 2 years later as a problem of subject and intention. He draws out what he sees as the multiplicity of interests or thematic strands in Rukeyser's play, concluding, "As I see it, you have a choice before you. Either a large play of symbolic attention accompanied by spectacular efforts in which Houdini is presented as the public sees him, mighty theatric baffling showman, or a far more immediate, realistic biographical play with occasional presentation symbolically and, as they say, poetically, of the implication of his life and genius." Wilder concludes, "At present, your play suffers from the fact that you have tried to do both." In 1952, Eric Bentley had articulated this precise critique more succinctly. He told Rukeyser, "You have written a play on two levels with no real stairway between them." I find the consistency in this criticism fascinating. For Rukeyser's interest seems to me to be precisely in both of these levels and more in their simultaneity. For her, Houdini's homely realism and the intimacies of his life coexist with his spectacular symbolic intentions. They interact and collide within the living system of his public art. This, I believe, is what kept her coming to him. In his critique of the play, Bentley questioned not just the junction of symbolism and biography, but the validity of the figurative resonance that Rukeyser was pursuing. "I find it hard," Bentley admitted, "to see Houdini's trickery as a symbol of the higher human impulses that you try to make it symbolize. After all, a lockbreaker is not Sir Galahad, nor Jefferson, nor Freud." This amazing assertion stuck with Rukeyser, so much so that she incorporated it directly into her play. Midway through Act 2, her character, Marco Bone, who has already introduced and described Houdini multiple times, announces, "This man is no Galileo, no Einstein, no Freud. This man is a lockbreaker, name of Houdini." Rukeyser holds fast to her conviction about Houdini's symbolic significance. Instead of rejecting the possibility of this power, she digs in, investigating Bentley's moralistic, higher human impulses, transforming his dismissive quip into an earnest consideration of the nature of Houdini's particular heroism. The edits she makes to the quotation from the letter are significant. From Bentley's list, she retains only Freud, whose relevance to Houdini is viscerally apparent in Houdini's frequent nudity as he was searched for hidden keys or tricks, his deep and performative devotion to his mother, and his obsession with staging, inviting, and evading his own death. Both Freud and Houdini uncover dark currents coursing under the still facade of our lives. But Rukeyser replaces Sir Galahad, the legendary knight embodying purity and piety, and Jefferson, founding father and public figure, with Galileo and Einstein, scientists and geniuses, thinkers associated with fundamental shifts in the popular understanding of how the world works, what our place in it is. In this way, Rukeyser's appropriation and revision of Bentley's assertion strikes a complicated tone. While accurate, Houdini was a lockbreaker. We suspect, reading it, that it insufficiently describes either his work or its significance. Freud, Galileo, and Einstein all herald shifts in seeing. And Houdini's art, his magic, is predicated on how we see or fail to see, the connection between what we see and what we make of that seeing, how we extend that lesson and example to our ongoing encounters with the world. Houdini's audiences must have been painfully aware of this negotiation as they watched his death-defying exploits with suspense and excitement, wonder and disbelief. In the play, Rukeyser's juxtaposition of an apparent negation of Houdini's significance with the grandly abstract lines that precede it, he met false hope, he fought false hope, point to the complexities animating both the character and our interest in him. As a lockbreaker, he is both man and symbol. Rukeyser's research about Houdini took various paths. In 1949, she started pursuing the rights to Arnold Kellock's 1928 Houdini, His Life Story, at first imagining her play as an embellishment of its information. By 1951, she realized that much of what she wanted was in the public domain, and she wrote terminating their agreement. One way she had come to describe and understand her turn away from this biographical record was through her idea that people are best seen in relationship. And she wrote to Houdini's sister Gladys Weiss in 1951, describing how all her edits were taking her in this direction, quote, away from the Kellock material and into the meanings of Houdini's life as I have seen it. The play is becoming freer, simpler in action, and more dramatic. But this turn toward her own response to the meanings was also interwoven with her search for and use of a documentary source, the transcript of the 1926 congressional hearings against fraudulent fortune tellers, which Rukeyser began trying to track down, as far as I've been able to tell, as early as 1948 in this letter. And she was still searching for the transcript in 1951 when Melville Cain wrote an aside to a letter about rights. I unfortunately haven't got the congressional minutes on spiritualism to which you refer. In the incorporation of the congressional hearings, I see one of the most important and radical aspects of Rukeyser's play, a direct link to her documentary poetic strategy in Book of the Dead, where she also collided fact and myth, there exploding quotations with the congressional hearings on silicosis with language and symbolism from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Indeed, this has come to be understood as one of the key techniques in the form her poem is seen to initiate. The congressional hearings on fortune telling are a truly strange episode in Rukeyser's play and also in American history. The star witness, Houdini, traveled to defend the amendment, which proposed adding fraudulent fortune tellers to the roster of offenders of public policy in the District of Columbia. In the language of this bill, infraction is constituted by the obviously objectionable concrete acquisition of another's money or property through fraudulent means. But the bill also takes issue with more inchoate transgressions, pretending to remove a spell, to protect someone, to unite the separated. These actions are harmful, not because of their relationship to property, but because of their relationship to the vulnerability and openness that attend belief. Rukeyser culls from the 169-page transcript of the hearings, about 20 pages or so of text, adding a staccato pace to the carnivalesque atmosphere that's already present in the historical record. Her most surprising lines, as Jan points out in her intro to Houdini, are actual quotations. Houdini, the original Houdini was Hindu, wasn't he? And I believe in Santa Claus. Those are actually in the record. As in the play, during the actual hearings, Houdini analogizes having one's fortune told to using, quote, a tiny bit of dope or opium, just enough to make you happy, and calling his wife as a witness, asking, quote, have I ever been crazy unless it was about you? Rather than obscure the stakes of the event, these bizarre exchanges highlight the serious tension at its center. The tension between registers of belief, manipulation and hope, authority, appearance, narrative, and fact. In her notes for the play, Rukeyser highlights and emphasizes the burlesque circus caller aspect, making explicit connections to her first act. But she also insists on the importance and seriousness of the material. This scene, the use of the hearings, becomes the breaking point for an early production agreement, which I think must have been with the producer Robert Whitehead in 1956. In these notes, which seem to be toward a press release following the 1973 show, Rukeyser traces her script's history, writing, "Begun as a ballet, it grew past a stage at which the Radio City Music Hall planned to give it a full show there, to a play, then to a play with music. Withdrawn when its producer asked Muriel Rukeyser to take off the last scene, he said nobody was interested in Washington hearings. It was offered its emergence by the Lenox Art Center this summer." The second act of the play seems to become also central to Rukeyser's disagreement with Grover Dale, director of the 1973 Lenox production, which there are some photos of here, including the amazing Christopher Walken from the Lakeville Journal that summer. She continued to collaborate with Dale until the complete dissolution of their partnership in late 1974. In an undated note signed with her initials, Rukeyser writes, "The reason the second act does not work is that my play has been," and I can't read that word in the archive, and Houdini has been made a fool and a passive weakling. He is stronger in Act 2 than in Act 1. He searches actively for his mother's message and loses Bess. He makes his way back to Bess and then attacks the mediums at the Washington hearing as a conscious man. The integrity of my play must be respected and performed. The second act must not be turned into feeble, quote, numbers with a passive marshmallow Houdini." For Houdini, the hearings are not about a harmless popular entertainment, but a struggle with the fathoming of truth, a crime committed against people's deepest and most secret hopes, as well as their larger schemes for understanding their place in the universe. But beyond his own early confessed and renounced dabblings in mediumship, his work as a magician retained uncomfortable similarities to what he was seeking to discredit. He too earned and manipulated the confidence of his audiences, creating effects dependent on their willingness to be deceived. During his testimony, the hearings turn away from the amendment and toward Houdini himself, whether he can be trusted as uninterested, whether he possesses special or supernatural powers. Because Houdini cannot or is not willing to give up his secrets, which are the basis of his fame, his livelihood, his identity, he must manipulate the terms of description. And so the left side is from the hearings. "Mr. Houdini, Conan Doyle stated that I possess mediumistic powers, which I deny. Mr. MacLeod, how can you prove it? Mr. Houdini, I admit that I do not possess mediumistic powers." In this exchange, Houdini shifts the terms from a denial to an admission of a lack. What he offers in response to the request for proof is a move from defense to confession, from "I did not do it" to "I confess that I cannot do it." In her play, Rukeyser zeroes in on the power of this rhetorical shift from the burden of proof toward the open-handedness of confession, slightly revising the original hearing. And this is Rukeyser's text on the right. "Spiritualist, Conan Doyle says he has supernatural powers. Congressman, what do you say to that? Houdini, I deny it. Congressman, can you prove it? Houdini, I admit that I am human." Rukeyser's version highlights the real nature of the vulnerability of Houdini's response. Using italics for emphasis, she shifts the language from an admission of a lack to an admission of being. What Houdini can do is contained by what he is. What he is the same as us, at risk in the face of both death and the requirements of communication. The dialectic between fact and fable is the location of his power. For Rukeyser, the hearings are a trial for Houdini, a public and psychic knot he must pass through. In this crucible, his mythic and intimate collide. Moving through it, he comes back to Bess, and distracted, utterly human, though completely in his strength, to death. Interspersing the documentary quotations with the fabricated scene of the medical students allows Rukeyser to entwine her registers, leading Houdini back to his concrete human self, the place from which she understood he, like all of us, was most powerful and most vulnerable. Houdini himself, who Rukeyser calls an artist who used all the materials of his life, was evidence of the staircase between registers and styles and intentions. Not just evidence, the staircase itself.
Well, those were two very powerful, evocative talks on Houdini. So, so let me just briefly transition to our third speaker present, and that's a Houdini expert, Matthew Solomon, who will begin with some comments of his own, but let me introduce you, Matthew. Matthew Solomon is an associate professor of the Department of Film, Television, and Media at the University of Michigan. He is the author of Disappearing Tricks, a silent film, Houdini and the New Magic of the 20th Century, and winner of the Krasner-Krautz Award for Best Moving Image Book, a monograph on Chaplin's The Gold Rush for the BFI Film Classics series, as well as Méliès Boots, Footwear and Film Manufacturing in Second Industrial Revolution Paris, which is in press. He's also edited 2 books on Méliès. And so I will hand things over to you, Matthew, and then I think we'll sort of naturally transition into a conversation, first between the 3 of you, but then we'll open it up. So the chat has things going on. We'll figure this out.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm going to go ahead and share a screen. I have some slides, and you will hopefully be more interested in those slides than in just a talking head. So you can see my screen, but hoping to get a full screen view. There we go.
Yeah.
So it turns out that the most productive outcome of the episode that I did for the BBC Forum with a couple of other Houdini folks was a very nice email from Elizabeth Daumer to be part of this conversation. It gave me an opportunity to read Rukeyser's Houdini, which I kind of had known a little bit about, but actually got a chance to read and engage with. And for me, reading this play addressed one of the kind of longstanding enigmas in our kind of historical understanding of Houdini, which is what might have been at the heart of Houdini's relationship with his wife, which I think, as far as we can tell, always was kind of a second fiddle to Houdini's relationship to his mother. So in reading this play, I was really drawn to moments where that which is not recorded in the archive, that which is inaccessible to history, Rukeyser has found ways to think about and to dramatize. So what jumped out at me is this conversation Houdini has with Marco Bone about his relationship with Bess, which I was kind of unable to sort out, but seems to be the moment in the play where we get some thoughts on what might be going on in that relationship. And part of the issue here is that the discourse on Houdini is overwhelmingly male. Those folks that are interested in Houdini are, I would say, somewhere between 90% and 100% men. And to think about, one, a female perspective on the life of Houdini, Rukeyser's in this case, is fascinating. And also to think about what was Bess's point of view on Houdini as the person who was closest to him throughout so much of his life. So the late Ken Silverman, who I had a chance to speak with when I visited New York and later when I lived in New York, unearthed what I found to be always a very telling quotation where Houdini says that his idea of comfort was sitting in an armchair in his library, hearing Mrs. Houdini call up, "Young man, your lunch is ready." And to think about the dynamics of Houdini calling Bess Mrs. Houdini, and fondly thinking about being treated like a boy whose lunch was ready, has always struck me as very telling. There's a photo of Houdini in his beloved library, and I've often thought about, well, what was that dynamic like? And this is a quotation you're all familiar with, but once I read it, I couldn't stop thinking about it. And it seems to me so phenomenally powerful, relevant. To read it as a man is, I just can't stop thinking about it. I had the benefit of reading part of Stefania's dissertation done at the CUNY Graduate Center where I used to teach, unfortunately not overlapping with her. And so some of this showed up in her presentation a little bit, but that's my source as much as anything other than the text of the play itself. So I was very interested in the fact that Rukeyser was working very closely with Harold Kellock's 1928 biography, going so far as to look into the rights, again, as we heard about. The piece that I thought was specifically, especially relevant was this idea that Kellock had drawn on Bess's view of the events. And so, I soon will reread that book and thinking about what Bess's contributions to that particular narrative, which has not been treated kindly by subsequent Houdini enthusiasts, biographers. There are plenty of factual mistakes, embellishments, but the idea that it might contain a shred of Bess's view of the events because she was still living at that time, even though her thoughts were being mediated by a fellow named Edward Saint, who became her second partner in life, to me is worth thinking about. So this book was, at the time, one of the few biographical accounts that would have been available to Rukeyser. What Kenneth Silverman later uncovered in his, I think, still definitive biography are other things. And in particular, Silverman uncovered a previously unknown relationship that Houdini had extramaritally at some level with Charmaine London, the widow who he met when Jack London was still alive. But it seems that their relationship, whatever that might have been, really took some kind of momentum during World War I. So Ken Silverman uncovered in Charmaine London's diaries and also in this inscription that she made for Houdini, pretty clear evidence that there was a relationship of some kind there. And this, I think, is another piece of evidence which we ought to think about in terms of a kind of female perspective on Houdini. I did a little of my own research, not specifically looking for this information, but when I saw in the finding aid that there was a letter there, I took an opportunity to look at it. So the envelope is addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Harry Houdini very discreetly. The postmark is October 18th, 1917. And the letter inside, this courtesy of the Harry Ransom Center, I won't read the entirety of the letter, but it's this closing which is perhaps most powerful. This is your letter. Please destroy it, but don't forget it. Houdini did not destroy it. He kept it in his archive, as he was wont to do. And again, it's suggestive. She enclosed this photograph with a letter. This is another, again, enigma. John Cox, who I think I saw him in the chat, has dealt with this in his really wonderful Houdini blog, which I would refer you to if this is a sensational topic you're interested more about. My own interest is in thinking about how this perspective on Houdini evolved archivally. I'm very curious about this 1985 version in Poetry East, how the play evolved, some of which we heard from Stefania. My own point of reference is the Ragtime book and musical based on Doctorow's kind of historical imagining of Houdini. So that's been my point of contrast. And one of the things that emerges in Doctorow's narrative and its dramatization as a musical is the role of race, and particularly the Coalhouse Walker character. So I was surprised and delighted to see that Rukeyser has also engaged with this much earlier, namely in this scene where Houdini speaks to Black prisoner and prisoners and says, I can't help you, which is a remarkably honest but chilling moment in the play. And her inspired choice to have a woman of color, Valenti, be a key player in this drama. So that's a character I want to know more about. I'm curious who she was played by. We know Christopher Walken played Houdini in this production, but I'd like to know more about some of the other cast and some of these other characters that she invented, again, because the historical record doesn't provide for them. Their voices are not present in the historical record. So I'm relying on Stefania's wonderful dissertation. Another thing that emerged from this reading was the idea of Rukeyser as a multimedia creator. The fact that she studied to be a film editor, fascinating to me. As we heard from Stefania's presentation, she pitched this to RKO Radio Pictures as a film. And as we also heard, she was interested in Aaron Copland's thoughts on this. So she's interested in film, narrative, music, this kind of multimedia creator. I would link that very conspicuously to Houdini's own output. So we heard about the themes of body and sensuality, gender, particularly in Jan's presentation. I would add to this, the issue of time and speed that really came through in my reading of the play. And so I will treat you to some Houdini footage, which is silent movie footage. We have no idea what the music would have been. It would have varied from place to place, but I'll kind of just talk over these two short clips and then hand the mic back to Elizabeth. So the first of these clips comes from Houdini made a practice of having himself photographed and filmed whenever possible. So when he did a stunt, he made sure that newsreel cameramen were on hand to film it. And some of this film has survived. And what I would point to in these examples is the idea that for me, Houdini is not simply a live, death-defying performer, but also a kind of media magician who was deeply interested in the way that this intertitle was added later, that the media could be used to create a different kind of magic, and particularly to get across his stunts and spectacles to an audience that couldn't have been present for the feat itself. And so if we look at the records of the Keith Albee vaudeville circuit, what we find is that very frequently Houdini was using motion pictures in his act, and nobody objected to it. Nobody felt that that was somehow taking away from what he did on stage. It was a logical, meaningful complement to seeing him perform other kinds of feats before one's eyes. So again, from what little I know of Rukeyser, she seemed to have been very much interested in how live performance might coexist with various kinds of other media. The other connection that I would draw is that Houdini was himself a myth maker, as we know, but he was using film to kind of create his own mythology. So one of the earliest fiction film appearance that Houdini did was actually a fiction that was built around an actual escape. So the actual escape that he did in Paris, where he jumped from a bridge into the Seine, very similar kind of stunt as we just saw, he figured that it was just fine to embed that actual stunt, that real performance within a fictional narrative. So the entirety of this film does not survive. This footage, I believe, comes from the George Eastman house. But what we have here is a kind of fictionalization of something that was a kind of actuality event, a newsreel event that Houdini created a fiction around. And so, again, from what little I know of Rukeyser, her impulse is similar to take certain facts that are historical, that are grounded, that are actual, and to kind of build those out, and to build those out using the kind of powers and capabilities of the medium. So this final part of this very brief clip, we see transitions from an actuality newsreel type footage, very much like what we saw in that clip that was shot in Rochester, but Houdini embeds it into a kind of fictional scenario where he is chased by the Paris police. And we segue from a kind of, again, authentic documentary kind of representation to this kind of chase film type of aesthetic where he is pursued by the gendarmes. So if you're interested more in this topic, I refer you to this book, and in particularly to chapter 5. But let's stop there and continue the conversation.
All right. Thank you so much, Matthew. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Stefania. These are very rich talks. And so let's begin with the conversation. I know there are quite a number in the chat. There's also something on the question and answer. So maybe I would like to open it up perhaps first to the panelists, if you have a particular question to one another, and then open it up to the entire audience. or maybe you are, do you all have a, yes, if there is something in the chat that you want to absolutely answer, we can also do that.
I just
Yeah.
jump in. That was so awesome. And I might that Houdini mixing the fact and the made up play is just, my mind has exploded. I'm so excited. But I did want to say, I saw that there was some stuff in the chat asking about the Volanti as a figure. And I just wanted to just super quickly, I can show you a picture of her. The actress was Anita Morris. So just, you know, this is from there she is. And who went on, I think, to significant fame. There's a description of her down there. And she was also, I guess, married to Grover Dale, who was the director, who they had a falling out, that Rukeyser had a falling out with, and then was going to become Bess in the later productions, and then maybe Bess and Volanti were going to be conflated, and there were all of these conversations about those possibilities. So I just wanted to say that quickly.
Well, maybe Carly, you want to take a question?
Yeah, I saw some really great specific questions, especially about research and sources. So maybe we could start with Vivian's question from the chat. So I'm going to go back to this and we can kind of go through questions that come up. But Vivian had a question during Jan's wonderful presentation. So I'll go ahead and read that. And maybe Jan, if you'd like to answer it, or anyone else. So the question is, Vivian says, listening to you is inspiring, but don't you think she worked on Houdini while collaborating with Charles Nijinsky? And Vivian talks about research suggesting that about the musical being a ballet, which is so interesting. And then Vivian writes, that he writes to Elizabeth Ames Ayado about his discouragement with Rukeyser's progress. So maybe some response about that timeline.
Yeah, it's very, it's good that you bring that up. And I think that Stefania has answered, has responded through her presentation. When I decided to investigate whether or not to publish Houdini, I was completely reliant on what I found out about the manuscript through Jeff Flannery at the Library of Congress. I am absolutely not a Rukeyser scholar, and I used the information that was available to me at the time, which clearly was not comprehensive. So Stefania has answered. It's really very, very interesting to me that she began Houdini long before I realized. So I've learned so much through these presentations. Stefania, I want to read your dissertation. And it's great to also hear, you know, Matthew speaking about Houdini as well as about Rukeyser. So yes, Vivian, I just had the information that I had on hand at the time. I did the best that I could, but I am not a Rukeyser scholar, so I just didn't know that information. Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Yeah, I definitely got some more answers from that in Stefania's presentation. I don't know if you want to say any more, Stefania, or we can move to the next question.
So the way I also took these pictures at the Library of Congress like a decade ago. So the way it's organized is sort of by things that are tagged Houdini. And so the earliest things that I found in there were the 1939 poem. But it's also possible that there are, you know, other things sort of tucked into other folders that haven't turned up yet. So I don't, so that, you know, totally in that, you know, evidentiary from the archive, but there could be things in the 30s. I mean, for sure, if she wrote that poem, which is so fully realized, and published it in 1939, then that research had to have begun.
I'm wondering if there might be information in Monica McCall's archives also, which I just discovered as I was browsing through the internet this week. I think her archives are at BU. So Did you read through those as well in terms of finding information? No.
That's a great idea.
I think that there's a wealth of information there, just from the little bit that I saw online. Yeah.
Wonderful. I'm going to transition to our next laid out question, which is from the Q&A. It's also about transcripts and research. So I think some of it has been answered already, but maybe we can take a look at it. This question is from Mickey in the Q&A. So the question starts with, many magic historians have had trouble finding the Houdini fortune telling hearings from the 20s. So have panelists located reliable transcripts of the hearing, or was the mural research more from the many press artifacts? And there's also a point about how anti-Semitism and themes of the hearing are very relevant to researchers of many disciplines, and are they available? I've seen a lot of questions about, are any of these transcripts readily available?
Yeah, yes. And I tried to sort of retrace my steps to find them, sort of moving from different computers, and I couldn't get my hands on them again, but I can send anybody who's interested the citation. And if I remember correctly, they're at this point, I mean, it's so different now. I mean, Jan talked about this a little bit in her sort of process of, not having email and having to do this detective work, right? Like these transcripts are totally Googleable, right? So I'm imagining like Rukeyser spending, probably a decade trying to get her hands on these transcripts. But you can get them online. I can't remember if I did it through my institution or just through other digging. But if anybody wants to shoot me a note about that, I'd be happy to try to go back into that investigation.
And you might want to mention that Dorothy Dietrich just said to us, we have the hearing transcripts at the Houdini Museum in Scranton, Pennsylvania. So this is what, but it's great webinar like that. Yes, it's marvelous. Yes.
Yeah, that's a wonderful resource. Thank you, Dorothy. And Dorothy wanted to hear a bit more about Houdini's sister, Gladys. So does anyone have any thoughts to share on that?
I can also just say everything I have is just from what I found in the archive. But so I found evidence of they had a meeting at sometime in 1951. I don't remember what that is. And then there's a letter that Rukeyser writes to a friend that says something like, you can see how shaken up I've been by my meetings with Gladys, who I think mostly seems to have changed Rukeyser's understanding of the relationship between Cecilia and Bess and Houdini. And so then there's a long letter from Rukeyser to Gladys, which I quoted from, that sort of, talks about the moves that she's making and then asks some other questions. So I think in total, there are sort of a couple of notes describing the meetings and then just two letters. But again, that's just the, the stuff in that part, but really, really, really fascinating. And they seem to have had like a very nice sort of sit down together in conversation about this stuff.
I hope that answered John's questions a bit about the correspondences. Jan and Matthew, did you have any other comments on Gladys? Thank you, Stefania.
No, that's not my territory.
It seems, to think about somebody who thought enough to reach out to Gladys. Again, that was an inspired research choice, not spending her time in the microfilm room, but actually reaching out to people who were still around. So if any of that correspondence survives, I really want to know, what did Gladys tell her that changed her view? And how did that evolution, because I think this is as much as we're ever going to know, is going to be from those sources.
Wonderful. So that was most of our questions. I just saw one from Trudy pop up. Oh, so this is interesting, not necessarily restricted to Houdini, but about Rukeyser's work. So from Trudy, I was thinking about the emphasis on the body in the play. Do you see connections with Muriel's earlier interests in Whitman here too? So any responses on themes of the body in Houdini?
I think that that's a commonality. I think that it's a thread that exists in Whitman, and it runs through Rukeyser's work from her earliest poems through to the end of her life. The subject of the body, writing through the body. Yeah, Stefania.
Yeah.
Oh, well, yes. I mean, the eroticism of her work. And the locks of the body. It's both the body as sensual and the body as container. The body holding the emotions. You know, her extraordinary poem, Looking at Each Other, the lesbian body, the knowing, right, between bodies. Rukeyser writes about the body, through the body, in my mind, through all of her poems, through nearly all of her poems, yes. She's a poet who writes through the body, not through the top of her head, not through the head. So that's my reading of her work.
The only thing I would add to that is the Jewish body, right? And the specificity of what that might have meant for Rukeyser, for Houdini's audiences. I think there's something there, certainly in the way Houdini loved to be photographed, the scenarios that he loved to be filmed within, that there's something about the Jewish body here.
And that's really, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh,
No, go Jen, and then I'll
I mean,
jump in.
one of the things that I noticed in rereading the play the other day is the folk, like Volanti and Bess, and I think Marco Bones also talk about Houdini wanting to be watched. So looking at the body, his calling attention to his body, that's a whole nother realm of the body that's evident. And it's interesting, Matthew, that you talk about the connection in terms of the Jewish body. And meanwhile, she's writing this through the Holocaust also, the anti-Semitism. And so the visible body of the Jew as well.
Stefania, did you want
Yeah,
to?
that's so powerful. I don't know. I saw Marty came back on. I don't know if you wanted to say anything about that. I was going to go in a slightly different direction.
Yeah, I was thinking a lot during the conversation about that Houdini is working, you know, in many ways at about the same time as the Dreyfus affair. I kept thinking about French police chasing him, and that Rukeyser is in many ways hyper aware of her own status as an American Jew, not only in her writing about, you know, her life in an elite liberal arts college, but even, you know, to be a Jew in the 20th century, and the coalescence of her imagining Houdini, I think, is not accidental in terms of their shared Judaism. And you know, I was thinking there's probably more here about that.
And it's fascinating to me that Volanti, to me, is a counterpart to Houdini. You know, she is a high wire trapeze artist. She also works through her body, and she is, I mean, as Jan said, Rukeyser specified that Volanti is Black, and Volanti herself is aware of it. So when she says, "I am, you know, a woman of storm and desire," and you know, this is reminds me actually of a Maya Angelou poem. So she's, you know, when she says, I want my beer and bacon too, she's very assertive about herself. And so the way Rukeyser is thinking about race, I think, is interesting in the play. Also, then when we think about hostilities, which raises the idea, of course, that Houdini did the prison things as a stunt, and only when he did it, he realized, oh, there are human beings involved, you know, that I switched from one cell to another. And I haven't really thought that through. But I think in the play, Rukeyser suggests in her version that he began to think it through when he gave boots to children in Scotland, and, you know, things like that, that he became aware of the systemic nature, or more aware or more attentive, you know. So yeah, there are very interesting things going on.
I mean, he's just, Houdini is an extraordinary metaphor for Rukeyser. I mean, it just, so many of her concerns are reflected through the life of Houdini, the body of Houdini, and then Bess also.
Yeah.
Bess as a reflection of, I found myself thinking, you know, is Bess really a key as Houdini when I reread the musical recently. And she's given that extra, you know, the great iconic Rukeyser line. Is this a play about Bess Houdini?
It's about both. Yeah. Well, we could go on for way longer, but we have about 4 more minutes. So is there an urgent question or comment that you want to bring up? Then please go ahead.
I saw one more question that has not been addressed.
Okay.
And it was from Vivian about the gay Houdini. So any queer connections? I know we brought up the extramarital affair. So I don't know too much about this, but was there any queer readings of Houdini?
Well, I think you could do very strong queer readings through the focus on touch, for instance, on and shame, you know, because I think this is such a crucial aspect of how even early on there are these voices at the boardwalk, you know, do not, you know, shame, you know, do not touch this, do not do this. And the very last monologue, I think, of Houdini speaks very powerfully to this freeing of the erotic body in really non-heteronormative terms. That's what I would say.
Matthew, are you aware of information about that?
Well, I remember from grad school, one of my grad school classmates telling me how important those photographs of Houdini nude were to him as a young man. And I thought to myself, this is certainly, right? This has got to be part of it, in the same way that Eugene Sandow, the strong man, also an early cinema figure, was certainly a fetishistic figure for women, but also for men. And so the historical traces of that are, as far as I know, not been unearthed. But certainly Rukeyser was thinking about this and thinking about same-sex desire between women, same-sex desire between men, and the relationships between men were always, I think, biographically so important to Houdini. But I'm really very interested in how Rukeyser was thinking about those, you know, with several decades, with her own point of view. So it's there. I'd like to know more.
Well, in so many ways, doesn't Houdini also, I mean, his career struggle against the notion of what the contained male Jewish body, I mean, you know, the emasculated male Jewish body. I mean, all of that stuff. You know, Houdini is the guy that breaks locks. He's the guy that gets thrown in the river and comes out of it. He's the Jewish man constantly resurrecting himself. He's all of that stuff. And, you know, I think that kind of move toward a sort of hypermasculinity always has a queer edge to it.
That makes me think of Marco Bone in the play. There's a line from the narrator that Marco Bone and Bess both loved Houdini, which is a fictional sort of element, but I think that's a great point. So thank you for your answers.
Well, Eulerius has to think about Tarzan. So in the chat, I'm going to put the live stream, not the live screen, well, maybe. This has been a major technological challenge. And I have to thank Bill Hall, who's not on this call, on this webinar, as the videographer who's putting it all together. To me, it seems pretty magical. And so I hope to see you there. I'm not going to see you, but I hope you'll be there. And I will have to call an end to our wonderful meeting. So thank you, all of you. Thank all of the panelists. Thank you for all the participants, and thank you for the questions. And this is just the beginning. One of the wonderful things about Rukeyser, Stefania and I were talking about it, is that we always feel like we're at the beginning. And Rukeyser's whole ethos was live every day as if it is your first. So on that note, I will say goodbye, and I look forward to continuing our conversations. Yeah, thank you so much. Bye-bye. I have to press the end button. Okay, it's very hard for me to do.